You're watching WMBD News on the Record.
Welcome back. It's veto session in Springfield, where lawmakers returned to the state capitol to fix bills vetoed by the governor and clean up some bills that didn't make it during the spring. We have WCIA's Capitol Bureau Chief, Alex Whitney, to tell us what he's been seeing and hearing in Springfield. Alex, thank you so much for coming on.
I appreciate you having me on, Cameron.
So you're in the rooms, you're listening to the lawmakers, you talk to them. What's kind of been the biggest news and biggest talk around since lawmakers returned to the Capitol?
What's been interesting, we're in a veto session, but very little of the conversation has been actually about the vetoes. We only had a couple come down this summer, and both of them doesn't really seem like there's a whole lot of momentum to address them. The big focus in the legislature is this looming cloud of the federal government over the state, and how recent moves from the Trump administration have been affecting folks here in Illinois, and really what the state can do to address that, or if it can address that. And that's covering a bunch of different topics, whether that is ICE or the National Guard in Chicago, or SNAP and Medicaid cuts. There really has been a huge focus on what can we do about what's happening in Washington to lessen the impact here in Illinois.
That's really interesting, trying to see, especially after the big, beautiful bill passed, and see how it could affect them. One of the biggest talk is, and I think of one that probably most of Illinois are looking at, is the energy bill. What are you hearing about that? Do you think that has a chance of passing in veto session?
I think it does have a chance, and I think as far as the non-federal government-focused legislation, that is really probably going to be one of the ones with the best chances. The SRGA, the Clean, Reliable Grid Affordability Act, has been getting a lot of momentum this summer. It obviously was discussed quite a bit in the spring, but just did not make it across the finish line. But I am hearing quite a bit of momentum on that, especially with the expanded battery storage. That really does seem like that's going to be kind of the concerted effort from a lot in the clean energy field to build that battery storage. They feel like that's going to be one of the key components to bring those energy prices down for folks. So I really do expect a lot of that focus on the Clean, Reliable Grid Affordability Act, especially from what we've seen this summer. I mean, energy prices spiked quite a bit. So I think that's probably going to be one of the big focuses, and I think it has a pretty good chance of making it across the finish line.
And I think another one of those big bills is the Chicago Transit, which is facing a fiscal cliff at the end of the year. And obviously people in the downstate area, they're worried about that $1.50 delivery tax that was statewide. Now, it seems pretty clear that's probably not going to be the funding mechanism. But, I mean, there's a question. Will they even pass this in veto session?
Yes. Well, and I think especially with the way that we've been seeing these conversations about how can we address these bills, there's a lot of work that goes into crafting legislation before it makes it to the session itself. And it seems like a lot of these initial conversations are happening around these bills, which doesn't build a whole lot of confidence, especially when we're in a short session. There's only 6 days to work through all of this stuff. So it feels like we're having a lot of these initial conversations about some of these solutions, but there are those key issues. You mentioned the Chicago Transit Authority and making sure that they can prevent those predicted service cuts. I really do think there's going to be a big focus on that. And transit itself has become somewhat of a larger theme. Just earlier this week, I was speaking to a group that's pushing for more funding for a passenger rail from Chicago to the Quad Cities. That's been a project that's been discussed for a long time, and they're trying to get that last little bit of funding to get things across the finish line there. So, that focus on transit will be interesting, but it will be interesting to see how these lawmakers kind of take their divided attention on a lot of these issues with the short amount of time they have to work with it.
That's definitely true. And a lot of leaders in the state capitol have been telling people to kind of tamper their expectations. They can't do too much in 6 days is kind of what they're saying. Do you think, from hearing talks, that there's not really much legislation that's being passed, at least in the first 3 days of veto session? Do you think it might end up being more unproductive than it could have been?
I actually definitely think there's a potential for that, especially when we're seeing some of these, I wouldn't describe it as ad hoc legislation, but legislation that's really responding to current events, especially when we're talking about what's happening in Chicago, what's happening with SNAP and Medicaid. It really feels like it's a lot of reactionary legislation. And a lot of that reactionary legislation, it can be difficult for it to get traction, especially because it feels like people have so many different directions that they're being pulled. So I think an unproductive session, especially what we've seen earlier in the week, right? We're practically halfway through this veto session. We've seen very little productive movement on a lot of these bills. So an unproductive session is, I think, unfortunately, a probable outcome with this session.
All right. Thank you so much, Alex. Really appreciate you breaking that down. And thanks for coming on. After this, we'll have your local sports. Make sure to stay tuned.